The light wasn't supposed to do that. It was supposed to obey. It always obeyed. She stared at the laser beam, thin, blue, and unblinking, shooting straight into the camera sensor. It had been hours since he first set up the experiment, testing out a new concept for his upcoming gallery exhibition. The walls of his tiny studio were lined with old photographs, faded portraits, landscapes captured through his meticulous lens. But the photography was always just the surface. The real work was in the way he manipulated light. That he knew the science of it backwards and forwards, angles, reflections, apertures. But the magic was in what wasn't seen, the way light could change how we saw the world. For years, she had been obsessed with creating images that didn't just capture the world but bent it, reshaped it. He wanted to manipulate perception itself, which was why, when he'd gotten his hands on the new prototype laser, he'd been so damn excited. It wasn't just any light. It was a weapon of precision, capable of creating hyperrealistic projections, images so lifelike they could almost fool the human mind into thinking they were real. He was hoping to capture something more than just a pretty photograph. He wanted to capture an experience, and the beam was doing its job perfectly, except that now it was doing something else. She's heart raced as the beam flickered, then surged brighter, its edges quivering, blurring. His stomach flipped. He hadn't set it up for this. He hadn't asked for this. Suddenly, the laser shot a violent jolt of light across the room. It wasn't a usual flare of brightness. It felt like the air around him cracked open, like the room was too small to hold it. She stumbled backward, his body smacking against the cold concrete wall behind him. A sharp pain shot through his head, and everything around him flickered, the photographs on the wall, the lights overhead, even his hands. For a moment, he couldn't tell where he ended and the room began. His thoughts didn't seem to belong to him anymore, swirling into strange images, a field of grass, vast and endless, a mountain range with peaks far beyond reach. Was this the result of too much caffeine? No. This was something different. He tried to call out, but no sound came. The beam was brighter now, his vision distorted into fragments, piecing together strange shapes in the air around him. Then everything stopped. It wasn't the world that stopped, it was him. He blinked. The light was gone, but the images, those two real images, remained. Impossible. She rubbed his eyes, unable to shake the feeling that something in his brain had snapped. But the images lingered. A snowstorm had begun to swirl in the corner of the room. A blue sky unfolded overhead, with distant peaks bathed in warm sunlight. He wasn't sure whether he was hallucinating or if it was just a trick of the light. But there was no mistaking the weight of the image. It was as if the mountains had grown from the walls, as if he could step into the scene and feel the chill on his skin, the weight of the air. What the hell happened? He took a cautious step forward. The snowstorm remained. He reached out and touched it. His fingers felt cold, though it wasn't real snow. It was a projection. A reflection of something that didn't exist but felt so real, so present. How is this happening? A deep, nagging part of his mind screamed that he needed to stop, that this wasn't normal. But the rest of him was intrigued, fascinated by the possibility. He didn't know how it had happened, but somehow, he'd become the architect of this illusion. It was no longer just light, it was an experience, something that was alive. The light. It's in my head. She stared at his hands, still tingling from the exposure. They were trembling now, but not from fear. He could feel the light inside him. He closed his eyes and imagined it, a flickering image of his childhood home, a small, two-story house that once stood in the middle of a sleepy neighborhood. When he opened his eyes, there it was. The house, exactly as he remembered it, standing in the corner of the room. The faint scent of his mother's cooking wafted in the air, though the smell was just a trick of the mind. A perfect replica. But real in its illusion. She felt a sense of vertigo wash over him, the air heavy with the weight of what he had just created. The room was still his studio, the walls of concrete and metal, the cameras on the workbench, but now, everything was distorted. He was no longer alone in the world of this studio. The house was there, pulling him into its past, inviting him to linger, and then something else happened that he wasn't alone in the room. There, standing in the doorway, was his father, his long-dead father, who had passed away years ago. She froze. His heart pounded in his chest that he opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. The figure of his father didn't move, didn't speak. It wasn't real, he knew that. But it felt so painfully, achingly real that she felt like he might suffocate in the moment. His father's face, as pale as a ghost, smiled. It was a smile he'd seen 1,000 times when he was a child. But it wasn't his father. It couldn't be, Dad. She whispered, though he knew the answer already. But his mind refused to let go. The illusion rippled, flickering like a weak signal. His father's smile faded, and with it, the house dissolved. The snowstorm evaporated like a cloud burst. The room returned to its sterile, clinical state, the one she had been so familiar with. But something had shifted. He wasn't the same. Neither was the room. Neither was his mind. For the next few days, she couldn't shake the feeling that his mind was no longer his own. The studio, his sanctuary, had turned into something else. He started testing the boundaries of what he could create, what he could manifest. It was a game at first. A game where the rules were his to dictate. He began creating small things at first, tiny, fleeting moments of beauty, the scent of rain on a hot sidewalk, the rustle of leaves in a forgotten park, the flicker of sunlight as it danced on a city street corner. He watched as they appeared around him, beautiful, ephemeral, and then vanished into nothingness, leaving him both satisfied and restless. But he could never hold on to them for long. He could only create the illusion of beauty. And that was enough. For a while, but then something more dangerous began to emerge. His creations didn't just appear, they started sticking. They began to persist in ways they hadn't before. The line between what he made and what was real began to blur. One evening, she projected an image of a serene lake, blue water, gentle ripples, and for a moment, he felt the coolness of the water at his feet. His mind ached with the vividness, the reality of it. When he closed his eyes, the scene remained, lingering in the dark corners of his mind like an unfinished dream. That was when he realized the danger. This was no longer just a trick of the EYE. Was a parasite that he had become its creator, and its prisoner. He could control the light, yes. But it wasn't light anymore. It was an invasion. And he didn't know if he could stop it. She stood motionless in the center of his studio, his body frozen in place as he stared at the projections around him. It was as if the room itself had become a canvas for his mind's eye, and yet, something in him recoiled. He could feel it, the subtle shift, the nagging presence that reminded him this was no longer his own creation. He was no longer the master here, something else had taken control, the lake. He hadn't intended for it to stay. He hadn't wanted it to linger, but it had. The blue water shimmered in the corner of the room, a perfect reflection of his own emotions, calm on the surface, yet turbulent underneath. The ripple spread out like a slow pulse, the edges of the lake blurring at the edges of his vision as though it was creeping into the fabric of his reality. He could hear the faint sound of water lapping at the shore, even though the studio was silent, save for the hum of the lights. His hand reached out, trembling, as he neared the edge of the projection. "This is wrong." She jerked his hand back, a wave of dizziness crashing through him. The studio seemed to spin, the walls stretching and contracting like the room itself was breathing. He staggered backward, clutching his head. The images flickered again, flashing from the tranquil lake to something darker, a twisted reflection of the peaceful scene. It was no longer just a simple image, it had depth. He could feel it, pressing against his consciousness, pushing into his mind like something alive, something hungry. A sudden dread filled him, the creeping sensation that if he let it in any further, he would lose himself completely. His heart raced, and he realized he wasn't just afraid of losing control over the projections. He was terrified of the idea that they had control over him. These images, these flickering pieces of his own mind, were more than just figments of light. They were becoming part of him, merging with his thoughts, filling the spaces between his memories and his fears. And worst of all, he couldn't seem to tell where the illusions stopped and reality began. He snapped his eyes shut, willing himself to focus, to ground himself in the present. But when he opened them again, the world around him had changed. His father was standing there again, this time, in the middle of the room, as real as anything else. His face, pale and sharp, stared at Lin Shi with a look of quiet sadness. He opened his mouth, but Lin Shi knew, it wasn't his father. Not really. It was the product of his mind, the manifestation of guilt and longing. "Dad, stop," Lin Shi said, his voice shaking. He wanted to run. To escape. But he couldn't. The projection had already anchored itself to him. His father's lips curled into a ghost of a smile. "You don't need to be afraid, son." Lin Shi's chest tightened. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. "You're not real," he muttered. This is just a trick." But the image of his father didn't flicker this time. It stayed. It was too real. A surge of panic gripped Lin Shi. He turned, desperately scanning the room, looking for an escape. But the illusion had expanded, reached farther than he'd intended, swallowing everything in its path. The walls of the studio had disappeared, and in their place, an endless stretch of the landscape he'd created earlier, the lake, the mountains, the sky, spread out before him, stretching on for miles. The air was still cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The illusion was no longer confined to a corner. It was consuming him. The world he'd carefully crafted was closing in on him, suffocating him with its perfection. The beauty that had once been his escape, his art, now felt like a cage. The world outside, the one where light and shadow obeyed natural laws, seemed so distant, so unreachable. "Stop!" Lin Shi screamed, his voice cracking. He raised his hands, trying to push the illusion away. But it clung to him, wrapping around him like tendrils, weaving itself deeper into his mind. And then, for a moment, just a fleeting, awful moment, he wondered if he was still in control. Or if the projections had already taken him over. He could feel them, wrapping themselves around his thoughts, his memories, his very essence. He was becoming a part of them. A part of this perfect, false world. "Please, help me," he whispered, his voice trembling. But there was no answer. The sky overhead began to darken. The light, which had once been his ally, now felt like an enemy. It dimmed, then flared brightly, like a spark ready to ignite a fire. He could sense it, feel the pressure building in the air around him. It was too much. He had to break free. But how? With a sudden burst of clarity, Lin Shi closed his eyes and focused. He thought of the moment, the exact moment, when the laser beam had first struck him. He thought of the overwhelming light, the shock to his senses, the way it had torn through his mind and left him, changed. He had never asked for this. He never wanted this, but now it was all he had. "Stop," he shouted again, his voice a command. His hands clenched into fists, and with all the force he could summon, he directed his will at the projections. For the first time, he felt a tremor in the world around him. The illusion wavered, just for an instant. The landscape buckled, bending like a wave crashing against a shore. But then it steadied again, the perfection returning, solidifying like an unbreakable wall. Lin Shi staggered backward, gasping for breath. His heart was pounding in his chest, his body drenched in sweat. He wasn't sure what had happened, but it felt like he was losing the battle. The images, the illusions, they weren't just fading. They were multiplying. And they were starting to devour him. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone on the nearby workbench. With shaky fingers, he dialed Jing Wei's number. "Please pick up," he whispered. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. "Lin Shi?" Jing Wei's voice sounded distant, unfamiliar. He could barely hear the tremor in her tone. What's going on? Where are you? You sound different. I need you. Lin, she broke off. The words were stuck in his throat, caught somewhere between fear and desperation. I don't know what's happening. Something's wrong with me. I can't stop it. There was a pause. He could hear her breathing on the other end, and for a moment, he thought she might hang up. But then, slowly, she spoke again. Lin, listen to me. You've got to get out of there. Do you understand? You need to stop. You have to stop this. I can't, he said, his voice raw. I don't know how. But before she could respond, there was a sharp crackle from the phone, and then, for a split second, he heard it, the sound of Jing Wei's voice, not from the phone, but from the studio itself. Lin, the words echoed around him, floating like whispers in the air. He looked around in horror, his heart racing. Her face was there, in the distance, floating in the sky like a reflection in water. But it wasn't really her. It couldn't be. Jing Wei's voice repeated, softer this time. You have to stop, Lin. You have to stop before you lose yourself. Stop, Lin, she whispered, as if the word might somehow break the grip of the illusion. But it didn't. The images were closing in, folding on themselves like the fabric of a dream, and in that moment, Lin knew the truth. He had already lost himself. The boundaries had shattered long ago. The light was no longer something he controlled. It controlled him. His mind, fragmented by his own creations, was slipping away. There would be no return. No way to undo what had been done. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the soft, fading sound of Jing Wei's voice. Goodbye, Lin. The darkness around him swallowed everything, swallowed the studio, the projections, the world. For a moment, Lin didn't know if he was still alive, if he still existed outside the confines of his mind. His body felt numb, his thoughts fractured, scattered in 1,000 directions. The light, the lake, his father, Jing Wei, they were all gone, or maybe they'd never been there at all. His mind felt like a black hole, spinning in on itself, pulling everything down with it, but there was something else. A flicker. A spark. It came to him slowly, like the afterglow of a fading dream, distant but undeniable. The images were no longer surrounding him, pressing in on him. Instead, they were in him, inside his head, like stubborn echoes of a world he had no control over. The projections were no longer things he could manipulate, they had merged with his consciousness, become part of him. Lin breath was shallow, ragged. His hands trembled, still feeling the weight of the light that had once been his greatest tool, his gift. Now it felt like a curse. He opened his eyes, not sure when he had closed them. His studio was still there, the familiar clutter of cameras, tripods, and lights. But it was dim, hazy, and every corner seemed to pulse with a strange energy. The walls didn't quite feel real anymore. They rippled, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. He blinked again, trying to steady himself. But the sensation only deepened. The world was shifting, bending like soft clay, refusing to stay still. The sound of Jing Wei's voice still echoed faintly in his ears. Goodbye, Lin. He reached for the phone on the table, but it wasn't there. The table wasn't there. Nothing was where it should be. He looked around, his mind struggling to cling to any semblance of logic. But there was nothing logical about this place, this world he had created and then lost control of. The light was gone. But it wasn't. He could feel it. It was always there, lingering on the edges of his vision, in the corners of his mind, as if the world itself had become one endless projection. Lin stood up, unsteady, the floor beneath him tilting as though it was made of soft sand. He staggered toward the door, his fingers brushing the wall for support, but the door, like everything else, wasn't really there. It rippled, faded, and reappeared, its frame uncertain and flickering like a badly tuned television. He reached for the handle and gripped it tightly. It didn't feel like a door at all. It felt like a projection, something he had made, something that had been created but could never truly exist. He pulled open the door, stepping out into the hallway of his building, but again, the world was wrong. The walls, the floor, they seemed to bend in on themselves. The edges of the hallway disappeared into nothingness. "Stop," he muttered to himself, gripping the doorframe harder, as if that might hold the world in place. His eyes darted back and forth, trying to focus on anything. But nothing was stable, nothing was real. He couldn't trust what he was seeing anymore. And then, in the distance, he saw her, Jing Wei. She was standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the light. She was still, her back turned to him, and in that moment, it was like everything else faded away. The distorted world, the flickering projections, they all fell silent, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Lin Shi's chest tightened. He stepped forward, desperate to reach her, to make this all stop. "Jing Wei," he whispered, his voice hoarse, trembling, but she didn't turn. She didn't respond. She stood there, as if frozen in time. He reached out, his hand shaking as he drew closer. He called her name again, louder this time, but it was no use. The space between them seemed to stretch, pulling her farther away, until the distance became too great for him to cross. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, no, no." His heart raced, his breath coming in jagged bursts as he reached out again, his mind scrambling for something to hold on to. The floor beneath him seemed to give way, and he stumbled, falling forward into the darkness. He landed hard on the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the hallway. He was back in the studio, his real studio, not the dreamlike distortion of the last few hours. The air was cool, the silence thick around him, but something was wrong. The walls were too close. The ceiling too low. It felt like he was in a box, like the entire room was shrinking. The shadows that had once been mere features of the space now seemed to writhe, to reach out toward him. His breathing quickened again, panic crawling into his chest. The projections were still here, still pressing against him. And then, as if to confirm his worst fear, the room filled with light, a blinding, unbearable light. It pulsed with intensity, just as it had when the accident had first happened, when he had been exposed to that laser. But this time, the light didn't fade. It didn't dissipate. It stayed. Lin Shi screamed, his hands flying up to shield his eyes. But there was no escape. The light had overtaken everything, filling every crevice of his mind, consuming everything in its path. His vision distorted. He saw flashes of images, his childhood, his father, Jing Wei, all layered on top of each other, twisted into a chaotic mess of memories and illusions. The scenes played out in a maddening loop, a spiral of his past and his regrets, his desires and his fears. The images came at him faster and faster, like a slideshow on overdrive. This isn't real. This isn't real. But even as he thought it, even as he told himself over and over that this was just an illusion, he couldn't escape it. The world was crumbling around him. He could feel his mind splintering, pieces of himself falling away with each passing moment, and then, the light did something else. It stopped flickering. It froze. And with it, everything else stopped, the studio, the projections, the voices, all of it halted, suspended in time. In the dead silence, Lin Shi stood, trembling, his mind a fragile thread holding on to the last shreds of reality. And then, something inside him broke. He felt the weight of it, felt it all, the grief, the regret, the guilt, all of it crashing down on him at once. "I can't escape." His body collapsed to the floor, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lin Shi understood the full extent of his own destruction. He had created this world, this trap, and now there was no way out. The illusions had bled into his mind, had become a part of him. And as he lay there, lost and broken, the light flickered one last time. And then it was gone. Lin Shi's eyes opened again, but this time the studio was still. Silent. Empty, for the first time in what felt like forever. The weight of the light was gone, but something else had replaced it. The room was empty, and the silence was suffocating. Lin Shi closed his eyes once more, feeling the final, crushing truth of it. He was alone now. Completely alone. There was no way back. He had become the sum of his own creations, and they had swallowed him whole.